Who's kicking us off?
Well, that's my second job.
Okay, go on then.
So I mentioned what Harry Selfridge was talking about in terms of experience, and you mentioned it there, and said what I really wanted to just ask both of you, first of all, was about measuring experiences, and is it that important in retail? Kate, do you want to?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I think experiential retail is great. I'm not sold on the idea of neon ping pong in the dark. I don't think it has to go that far and wide unless you're particularly a brand on the cutting edge. I think what we do terribly in retail is we look over the shoulder too much, see what's happening behind us, and then copy paste. And that isn't then with the filter of, is that relevant to our brand? Is that actually right for our consumer base? So whilst I'm glad we've moved out of the cheese and wine era, I still think there's so much to do that is about fitting the experience for purpose and fitting it for the brand and the audience you're working with. And actually, I would much rather, as I've just been saying, go in and have a wonderful customer service experience 7 days a week rather than an awesome experience 1 day of the week. I think you've got to balance both.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. And I guess I'd almost take a bit of a step back and almost look at why experiences have become so much more important for consumers. And in many ways, I genuinely believe that there's been a fundamental shift in the way that consumers perceive material possessions. We've essentially had 2 decades of importing deflation from China and many other countries where we've had prices that have consistently fallen for key sectors such as clothing and footwear, electricals, homewares. And it's almost led to an abundance of material possessions. And so I think everyone can relate to the fact that, I've got an iPhone 10, probably had about 6 iPhones now over the years. The first iPhone that I had, I attached economic value to. It changed my life, quite frankly. You can get it on the internet, on the move and things like that. Second iPhone, third iPhone, fourth iPhone. The economic value that I attached to each iPhone diminished, and it diminished over time. And I think if you take that concept across material possessions throughout the economy, because we've had this consistent fall in prices and rising living standards, it has left people wanting something more. It's left them wanting something different, and it's left them wanting experiences. And I kind of referenced this earlier, where actually the economic data supports this in terms of households are spending less of a proportion of their expenditure on retail products. They're spending more on experiences. Retailers realise that, and they have shifted business models accordingly. And so they're offering services, digitalisation of products and things like that. But also the fact that, going back to as a direct answer to your question, I think that you can measure experiences through different realms of experiences. And so we call these our 4 E's, if you like. Environment is really important, education, escapism, and entertainment. And actually, these aren't discrete choices for retailers. Consumers want a blend of all of these different realms of experiences, depending on age, depending on what you're buying, depending on price point and things like that. But actually, there is a way to really enhance the in-store experience, dovetailing with the digital experience by having digital touch points in store and linking up that customer journey, where I think experiences and digital can be at the heart of that.
It has to be relevant to you.
Yeah.
Because the turnaround plan of a major department store 3 years ago was, we're going to put brow bars and hairdry blow bars in. And you just think, well, everyone's already doing that. That it has to be relevant to you. It has to be new. It has to be different. It can't just be one size fits all.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting. When you're just saying that, I was thinking. So I went up on the opening day for Primark's new store in Birmingham. Which has anybody else been to see that? Have a look at that. It's worth a look, because that's quite an interesting one for me, because you walk into that store and it's what you don't expect to see: a nail bar and a barber's and a lady's hairdresser and so forth. And I'm I'm still, I think, making my mind up about that as to whether, does that fit with the brand, and is that just going to be a one-off? Well, actually, if you look at some of their other stores, Madrid would be a good example where it's a similar sort of thing. But it's something that I found quite fascinating because it's not something you expect to see from the brand, but it gives you that, and it's. Part of our business is also the psychology of the consumer, and one of the things from psychologists is that the memory of the experience is more important than the experience itself. Which is one of the lessons that I'm also glad that you didn't mention omnichannel there, by the way, Richard. You mentioned physical, because for me there's no such thing as omnichannel. But I found, I don't know if anybody here knows, the person who first coined that phrase. It was for a Harvard Business Review in 2011, a guy called Darryl Rigby. And I contacted Darryl and said, what's all this about? But it was just that. It was what you described, the physical and the online. Can I just come on to technology? There's so much out there, and I spend half of my life, it seems, attending various expos and conferences and so on and so forth. And I always think, if I'm a retailer attending one of these, unless I'm on a particular mission to procure something, I could get completely lost with this. So Richard, what are your views on, how is technology changing and perhaps transforming the customer journey?
I think from a customer perspective, the smartphone essentially has been that one device, that one portal that can take people and merge the physical and digital realms, where people, put it this way, customers don't think in channels, do they? They kind of seamlessly bounce between digital and physical, and often at the same time as well, to make their path to purchase relevant to them. But I think in terms of the smartphone, that is the piece of technology that's fundamentally changed the customer journey. And of course, smartphone penetration has increased across the population over the years, but it's really had the most significant impact has been at the very beginning of the customer journey, when we're being made aware of products, we're researching products that could be in store, and of course social media has had a significant influence. So, and if you look at some of the brands like ASOS, I think they've got 9 million Instagram followers. Boohoo have got about 7 million. Brands like Zara have got 33 million Instagram followers. Now, this allows brands and retailers to have a direct conversation with their customers, control that narrative, inspire them, but customers, and actually our research shows that customers, especially the Gen Zs and millennials, they still want the physical experience. They still want to go into store. They still want to touch and feel. And going back to your point about it's the experience and the memory of the experience that's so important to build brand awareness, to build brand equity, to increase loyalty, to increase the purchase frequency and things like that. But the piece of technology for me is the smartphone that's really fundamentally changed the customer journey beyond recognition. Just
on that then, before we come to you, Kate, so where do you think, and I don't know the answer to this, but where do you think we're going with the smartphone? What are we still going to have a smartphone in 10 years? Is it going to be something different? The kind of directional trend, I think, is that we will continue to have more powerful devices. I think 5G could potentially be a game changer in terms of the content that we're served on these devices. Wearable tech, again, is one of those areas where you can see it having applications and the more streamlined and kind of frictionless use of things like AR and VR. Again, it has to be relevant. It has to be useful. But the IKEA app, for example, where you can see what a table might look like in your front room using augmented reality. That's a practical and good use of technology. But I can just see that being the direction of travel. Yeah, Kate.
I think there's been so much cash wasted in Emperor's New Clothes types of dreams for technology. So I read about a piece where I went to actually go and speak to the retailer about the development of it. And it was a very big high street fashion brand. And the idea was that this mirror would come up and you would put in that you were going to a wedding on Saturday. And it would say, well, it's going to be raining on Saturday. And actually, within this postal area, a lady's already bought this dress. So you might actually have the same dress as someone else at the wedding. You might not, but you might. And you just think, when are you testing this about, the fact I can pick up my own smartphone, find out what the weather's going to be. And there's so much competition out there. I'm probably not going to be wearing the same as everyone else. It's got to have the sanity check of, do they want it? Is it going to help? Is it going to make a difference? And apart from the smartphone, I'm asked, which pieces of technology are life-changing, which have made a difference, which have been relevant to brand. And the example I always give in terms of the success is something called the Disney Magic Band. So if you go into Walt Disney World in Florida, obviously not if you book with Thomas Cook, but if you did, you are offered, and if you stay there, something that looks like a watch. That this is the key to your room. It's your charging facilities. It is your park access. It is the device that's going to tell you how long the queues are on all the rides and which ride to go to. It's going to tell you which restaurants to eat at. This is smart technology. This is also making sure your consumers go exactly where you want when you want them and give you all the data you need. But for them, it's benefit, benefit, benefit. And this is what I always speak to tech companies about when we're asked to get involved. What is the benefit to the consumer? What's the BFU? And if there are enough of them, then they are rewarded to use it. But if you think you're just going to come up with some hocus pocus and it's smart, but it's actually not common sense, it won't be used. And I worry about how much lost investment we've made there at the loss of the opportunity for something else.
Yeah.
What do you?
Yeah. I mean, for me in retail, I think that artificial intelligence, AI, the take-up has still been relatively slow. But it is starting, and it's and across the piece, you can imagine in from the back office, from supply chain right the way through to self-service checkout and whatever. I mean, one of the more bizarre examples I saw quite recently. Has anybody seen I think it's who owns the Oral-B brand, Procter & Gamble, I think it is. Anyway, P&G seem to think that we're going to spend the best part of £180 on a toothbrush which has AI built into it. So I saw this. I think it was launched in the States in about March this year, and then I think it's this month in this country. And I thought, because I think that AI will be embedded pretty much in most of retail operations, and particularly with personalisation. But I saw this and I thought, well, how does it work? And apparently it maps how you brush your teeth, and then supposedly will tell you how you can more effectively and efficiently brush your teeth. And that's for 180 quid if you really think.
Bargain.
But, yeah, exactly. But interesting that's the kind of line of direction. And I think personalisation, I think today, I think in 5 years' time, we'll look back at 2019, 2020 and say, well, that was pretty crude even then. And there's a great example that I use. It was a tweet. It was actually from last year. Somebody, I think she's an author, and this was very well known. They started off in 1994 as a online bookseller, so we know who I'm talking about. And of course, if you buy anything there, then you're going to get the pop-up ads and the emails and so on and so forth. So she needed to buy herself a new toilet seat. That's a very practical thing that you need to buy. She just needed one of them. And of course, what happened? She got all the follow-up pop-up ads and emails, and so she tweeted this and said, "Dear, I'm not a toilet seat fetishist. I don't have any sort of hankering to get another one. It doesn't matter how many times you contact me. I'm really happy with just the one that I've got." And it kind of said, this whole thing about personalisation needs to be relevant, and it needs to be in the moment and in context. And I think that's just around the corner. And when that starts to happen, actually, I think we'll get real value delivered to us, and it's quite exciting.
Yeah. And talking about of the moment, I think sustainability is one of those topics that is at the heart of retail at the moment, and I think one of the things for me is essentially lots of consumers talk about caring about sustainability and ethical sourcing, but the reality is would they be prepared to pay for it? Would they actually be prepared to pay additional or extra for to either switch brands or pay extra for particular products that are sustainably and ethically sourced? What are your views on that?
Yeah.
Well, I started my retail journey as one of the first females sourcing in Guangzhou, China. And I watched this factory evolve overnight because there was going to be a very famous retailer come to do a factory inspection with plastic shoes and eye goggles and everything. And they were all thrown, and very young members of staff, I'm being polite, came out then back into the factory floor, and they were tipping all the dye straight into the paddy field next door. And this was a retail brand who had great pride in their ethical and environmental stance. And one could argue, well, the factory has not presented itself fairly, so how could they truly know? And one can say, did they really do the diligence to know what the factory looked like? Were they just greenwashing? And I think the consumer expects this respectful and fair relationship, and they want more information as they become more aware of the devastating effect. And we call it the blue planet effect. People suddenly are very much more aware of this. But they feel a lot of this should be at the manufacturer and retailer's cost. They believe they should be just doing it right to start with. When we did tests, and this is probably 15, 20 years ago, we always used to talk about no more than 5% would pay any more for something that was E&E. I think that's changed now. I've definitely looked into new research, millennials saying that. But there is this pick and mix culture, and you can't deny that. We can't not accept that. It's not a case of telling consumers off. That's their will, that's their way. Sometimes they're buying oodles of plastic and want the latest neon inflatable swan to do their pool Instagram shot on. And the next minute they're talking about wholeheartedly they don't want to see another coffee cup that can't be recycled. And we can't critique, well, we can critique it personally, but as businesses we have to say, well, this is the state of play we're given. How do we do this? And what I feel is uncomfortable at the moment is that retailers and manufacturers are nervous and concerned and therefore holding everything back. And I think it would be fairer and better to say, this is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And we have to tell you about the stages that we're going through and the developments that we're making stage by stage by stage, and help guide us. What would you prefer? Would you prefer this or this as an environmental ethical option? Tell us and we will choose that one, but we can't have both right now and still deliver you for £5 or a pound bikini. So I think this is much more about mutual conversation between consumer, retail, manufacturer, and being realistic rather than actually just overpromise again and you're not delivering any of it.
I don't know if anybody here has seen, I think it was yesterday, I watched it this morning on the train, the address, if you could call it that Greta Thunberg gave at the climate change conference. Did anybody see that? She was an angry young lady. And I think "how dare you" is now trending as a hashtag on Twitter. So she really kind of, it'd be very interesting to know who wrote her script. But at the same time, we can be as cynical as we like, but I think that it is right that climate change, what we're doing to the planet, sustainability is very, very high on the agenda. Whether it's right to the top yet, I'm not sure about. But yeah, it is this dichotomy that you've got. If you asked everybody in this room, if you asked, did any sort of straw poll, I'm sure everybody would say yes, we care about the planet, and we try to be, support sustainability and so on and so forth. But then when you look at their own personal buying habits, it's sometimes very difficult. I mean, I was at a dinner yesterday evening and chatting to one or two people, and somebody came out with a statistic, which I admit I wasn't necessarily aware of, but it might have been from their particular brand. It was a large UK supermarket. And they said that of their customers, 25% had just £5 left over at the end of every week. Now, that being the case, are you going to care about, what you're doing to the planet? You're probably going to think, well, no, that's for, somebody else who can afford perhaps to pay the perceived premium for it. So it is a difficult one, and I think that change won't happen unless there is more of a stick than a carrot, so legislation. So if we think back to, for those of us old enough to remember when we were all told that we really should put our seatbelts on when we got in the car, and there was a very famous campaign run by somebody who I won't name because we've forgotten about him. But it was to teach us to, but that carrot became a stick. And I think now we all put our seatbelt on, and it's socially unacceptable to drink and drive and to speed and these sorts of things. I think that what we will start to see, and I think you're right, Kate, that it's a marathon, not a sprint. We're going to see that shift, and it will become socially unacceptable to be seen with whatever it happens to be, whether it be a plastic straw or a plastic coffee cup or what have you.
Yeah. And what I would add to that as well is I think that there will be this kind of tipping point, if you like, where that's social acceptance of the way that we consume products will change. And I think that actually offers an opportunity for retailers who can put sustainability and ethical sourcing at the heart of their business to create a point of differentiation, to have their greener credentials against their kind of greyer, polluting competitors. And actually, I think the role of sustainable influencers, I think, will also become more prominent, where retailers will be using sustainable influencers to really build that ethical and sustainability values into the brand. And I genuinely believe that I'm not sure if we're there yet, but we're approaching a point in time where retailers can really use that as a point of differentiation to stand out from their competitors. So, and talking about a point of differentiation, some of what I spoke about earlier is challenges on the high street are tough. Profitability is under intense pressure. And a lot of the pressures being felt on the high street, rising costs, shift in consumer shopping behaviour, rising vacancy rates, landlords that are under trouble. What does that spell for our high streets in the UK? Are they dead or dying?
No, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, my sort of preamble. No, they're not. Although, yeah, it'd be very easy to make a case for that. But what's happening, I think, what we're living through, what we're seeing is a period of probably unprecedented levels of change and the pace of that change. I think that on the one hand, no, the high street isn't dying, and certainly retail isn't dying. That's clear. But it does need some help. It does need some support. So, as an example, that you mentioned rising costs, and whereas rent isn't too bad, rates, we can't have a conversation like this without mentioning business rates, because I think it's important. It's an important issue, and it's one that's being largely ignored. And for me, the Future High Street Fund, I'm sorry, but that just doesn't cut it. When you consider that retail contributes around about 8 billion. Total business rate, I think, is about 30, but retail itself is about 8, and that was less than $1 billion, in that fund, which I don't think is going to be. Well, I know the decisions as to how that will be, awarded, if you like, aren't going to be made until at least next spring. Mm-hmm. And on that subject as well, you hear a lot about how are we going to resolve that. And then you hear people talking about online sales tax, which for me is just crazy, because for a start, where's the sales attribution now? Because of we talked about customer journey. That journey can start and end anywhere, and it can go through a myriad of different so how on earth do you decide what is online and what isn't now? It's all becoming one. It's all just shopping. So I think that the high street does need support. It needs it quite urgently. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, yes, there is, as I mentioned earlier, there's this natural process of evolution happening. Let's be honest, there is some poor retail out there. we can't hide that. We shouldn't gloss over that. I far prefer to talk about the great retail out there, and there's plenty of examples of that. But yes, there's it's kind of poor, lazy would probably be another word for it, and it's just simply hasn't moved with us, because I think that us as the consumer, we are the biggest disruptor. Nobody else, it's us. And I think we've kind of touched on some of those reasons for that. And that's having a profound impact on the high street.
So just on so that's quite a kind of upbeat, positive, optimistic view.
Some would say naive.
But is the reality that we're just going to have fewer high streets, though, in the UK?
I'm not sure we're going to have fewer high streets, because as I said earlier, the high street equals the centre of the town centre, and vice versa. So I'm not sure but we're going to have different. So we're going to see a far greater mix. Mm-hmm. So if we think about, over decades, the high street is largely equal retail. Then it became, obviously I had estate agents and charity shops. We know why we have plenty of charity shops, and hairdressers, and probably the only thing you can't get online at the moment. But I don't think there'll necessarily be less high streets, but there will be that different mix. So we'll have more wellness. It could be gyms or other sorts of things, office, residential. And that's not necessarily a bad thing when you think that if that brings people in, well, they're going to need to be fed and entertained and so forth. So we're just seeing a different mix.
Okay. Kate?
I really believe in our high streets, and I really believe that it is a social issue. We can't look at retailers and say, you have to remedy all of this. This is your problem. This is your creating. Mend it, because our high streets of the future are going to be community zones. They are not going to be purely retail focused, and we've got to go through that transition. Do we have the right people in local authorities who've got the experience to have the vision to see what that could be? Not in every case. Even a lot of the bid teams are made up from a very retail base, and I don't believe the answer is retail. So we have two major crises I touched on earlier. We have an isolation crisis, which I think is absolutely borne out of the fact that we've got jeopardy on the high street because we're just not pulling people together as much. And we've also got health, mental health and obesity crisis, all which could create much more support if there was a community there with green places, green spaces, opportunities for communities to get involved. And there's this brilliant author from the 60s that said, places should be built by the people who use them, paraphrasing. And I really believe in that. I don't think there's anywhere near enough public involvement with what they want it to be. That has to happen too. Do I believe that retailers could have had a golden moment that they've missed? I think a lot of them have, because I think the good times, the cash was taken and dividend out, and I don't think it was reinvested enough in the future. It was hard for them to dictate what all of the future could look like, but I think they definitely could have seen some of it in the crystal ball. I don't think retailers are still engaging with it. I don't think they're looking at their operation hours. I don't think they're looking about their community focus. I don't think they're making the vanilla state high street we got, where you actually got off a train in the UK and didn't even know where you were anymore because it all just looked homogenised. I don't think they did enough to create that idea of communities having the DNA that they should have of towns and place. But I don't think we can wag our fingers purely at retailers. I am really nervous because I've been involved with local authority. I've been involved with placemakers. I've been involved with retailers. There's just not enough cohesion. People are not working together enough. And it won't be the downfall of high streets and place in 10 years' time because it couldn't be done. It will be the downfall because not enough people in the right places got together with the right experience to say this is a common issue and it will only be solved by all of us doing this. So as a retail and service industry advisor, my most predominant work in the last 10 years has been building alliances with the sporting industry, which has been really difficult because it's a very different mindset, a very different industry, but I've built them now. They're robust. So I can start understanding how I can build a running track into a town centre and within the isolation and community purpose in charities, so that I can understand how do you solve a problem like loneliness. And I'm actually using those now to start pulling them together to try and work on how can I get all of these people in the same room to start the conversation.
I think one of the things that resonated with me, you talk about cohesion, and I think one of the biggest challenges in repurposing high streets and making them fit for purpose and relevant to their local communities in many senses, because we're just dealing with so many different stakeholders, especially on high streets. Any typical high street might have tens, if not hundreds, of different landlords that have different objectives, that have different levels of skin in the game. To try to coordinate a common objective around so many different stakeholders, I think will be incredibly challenging. I completely agree with your point about repurposing high streets to include more leisure, more residential, and a different blend of retail. And if you look at the high streets in secondary locations that are still faring well against all of the structural change, they usually are those high streets that are either near transport hubs or where people live or work. And I think, and I can see as well, that for some shopping centres that are under pressure, I think that all of those characteristics of a different blend of office space or residential and things like that, we'd almost have a situation where some landlords will have to invest in creating almost bespoke community purpose centres, where shopping centres will be turned into kind of residential areas where actually the tenants, the residential tenants, will be there that kind of pay a service charge that covers all of their kind of multimedia, their Sky subscription, their weird gym in the building. They will cover cleaning expenses and utility bills and things like that, where the landlord can buy and share those economies of scale to make for cheaper accommodation, where all of the residents are essentially serving the retail that's within that scheme as well.
So we need to talk about the retailers themselves in terms of how they define, I guess, reassess their value, their purpose. What 2020, that's the idea of it. What's the big picture? Obviously, we can't go through the detail of every single retailer and their own individual plans. But if you were sat as CEO of a retail organisation and you're creating your 2020 Beyond plan, 2030 Beyond, how do you create a purpose that's going to be profitable, that's going to have purpose, that's going to have fit for the consumers that are ever changing, Andrew?
I think one of to pick up just kind of on the property angle of it, because what we've been seeing over the last number of years is that, or I'll start again, go back before that, and we saw leases which were very, very long, typically 20, 25 years. So that was, and what we're seeing now is that the average is around about 7, I think it's 7.2, something like that. So it's becoming more agile. We know that in the 80s, 90s, and so on and so forth, success and growth was seen as opening more stores, and of course now what we're seeing is a reset on that, and people are realising that they have too much space, and that's well documented. So realising the value, one interesting example that opened up a couple of weeks ago. This is Puma opened up a new flagship on Fifth Avenue, and you go in there and they have what they call a skill cube. And basically, Puma have a number of sporting ambassadors, footballers, and they have motor racing Lewis Hamilton and so forth. And so in virtual and augmented and any other, you go in and you have a training session with them. And when you listen to what Puma have to say about this and why they've done this, this is all about using the store, the physical, to engage their fans, not their customers. That's their language. Their fans, and I think that the good news is that yes, there'll be less stores, but they'll be far better, because the store will be the physical embodiment of the brand, and that's where you can really understand your customer and what they want and the way that they want to interact and engage. Yes, we can glean an awful lot from behaviour online. I think what we will see far more of is the same sort of analytics being played out as to how we shop a store, how we navigate dwell time, et cetera, and then linking that with marketing, merchandising, commercial functions to really understand how and what we want out of a store.
Is it about creating fans, Richard?
I think it is. Yeah, no, I think it's about creating fans through meaningful experiences within physical locations, but also digital platforms and merging the two together. I think from a retailer point of view, the way that they look at stores and value stores and perceive the purpose of stores is changing. And I think that that kind of shift in mindset is more towards looking at stores, using a kind of digital analogy, as kind of cost per acquisition. These are customers that come into store that you can have an immersive experience with the brand, build that loyalty. They may not shop in that store, they might not buy anything on that occasion, but it doesn't matter. It's about being able to, and we know this is happening now. You walk into any store and people are on their mobile phones. They might be buying from that store, they might be buying from something from a different store, from a competitor. But the fact is, consumers just bounce across different physical and digital channels. But the main thing is that we might spend more time online. So the evidence shows that we spend more time online browsing for retail products. That might be on retailers' websites, that might be on social media platforms or marketplaces, whatever it might be. But actually, the physical experience of entering a store is more impactful on the path to purchase than digital platforms. And so this is why it's so important to have that for retailers, and of course this is happening, is that shift in mindset towards what is the value of the store. And it is about building the brand, about the experience, and looking at the store as a cost per acquisition, as a marketing expense, rather than those traditional metrics like sales per square foot and all of the others that essentially are redundant now.
I think if I was in that position, I would also be looking at creating partnerships. I think it's too tough alone. I think the next 10 years are going to be too challenging. And I think I would be picking up the phone and thinking, who's complementary, non-conflicting to me, that I could actually start to work and be that sharing space. So for instance, you've got the Disney and Primark experience, so you've got Disney and Target experience. So Disney are not going to roll any more stores out in the UK of their own brand in at any time soon, as I understand. But they've got these areas where they can't service with a physical retail presence, where they're doing it with partners. And I just think, we know this is done with the design partnerships. You're always seeing singers and sports people tying up with the brands. Why not the brands tying up with the brands? As long as it's not going to eat into your market share, this is an opportunity to start looking at that space and repurposing the space, making the event better, talking to people and say, we have synergy, just like you're connecting through social media, we're connecting too. And it doesn't have to be all long-term, it can be short-term as well as longer-term. But I think we've just got to actually take practices. The car industry does this. You will go to each other's factories, you will share knowledge. It's the food industry as well. We have to start using this ability. We can't keep the silo mentality of, I want to be a generalist. If I can sell just one more of your products, I'm going to be happy doing that, and I'm going to go this solo cowboy alone. I actually think it's time to say, no, okay, what are we going to do? What are we going to be brilliant at? And how then can we widen our opportunity to talk to people by actually building bridges? And I just think it's time for retail to build bridges. But one of the fundamentals of traditional retail is property. We know that we've got 1 in 4 stores closed. We've got 12 store closures a day. It's the doom and gloom. It's the headline that runs and runs and runs. So what is the retail property landscape going to look like in the next 10 years, Richard? And how do we actually start to see some change there?
I think we touched on a lot of these themes already about the changing mix, the purpose of the high street changing, things like that. So I'll focus on something slightly different, which is I think the economics of store-based retailing has changed and is changing. All of the metrics around kind of rental costs or investment expectations, the space that we have in retail capacity has pushed rental costs down. I think that will allow new retailers, independent retailers, to be able to occupy physical spaces that are commercially viable. Dovetailed with having an online presence and being able to offer extreme convenience in many cases. So I think, and I can't remember who mentioned this before, but essentially the concept of we went through the last decade of rapid expansion in physical space. It was all about land grab and to increase market share. It was all about having more stores. And of course, we've seen a reversal of many of those trends now. And I think we will see a reversal of cloned high streets, where we'll have a much, much bigger presence of independent retailers. Also with service provision, so the hairdressers, the beauty salons, and the more experiential leisure element of that as well. And actually, if you look at some of the data around the number of stores, it's actually increasing. We've got more retail stores today than we had 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And it's just the mix of the stores is changing. And the polarization in terms of the flagship versus some of those secondary locations is changing. The number of stores occupied by large multiple retailers is consistently falling because of all of the challenges that we spoke about, but that gap is being plugged by independent retailers. And I think that's going to be the major shift in terms of the visible shift that we're seeing on our high streets.
Yeah. I was talking to someone just the other day, and she's based, I believe it's just outside Manchester. And anyway, well,
not in the north.
In the north, yeah, anywhere north of Watford is.
Were you all right speaking to her?
Fascinating talking to her because she's putting pop-ups into existing large, well-known department stores using that space. And I thought, and I need to talk to her again because it's a fascinating, for me, really interesting, one, that she is being allowed to do it and that they are allowing her, these big brands are allowing her to do this. So, and we've seen one actually in the store at Oxford Circus with Topshop. So that's, but more than that, more than pop-ups. So, the answer isn't, we're going to have our high streets, completely overrun with pop-ups. That won't happen. But I think it's quite interesting, exciting. But also, to your point, Richard, that, I think we're going to see that the mix of the high street will change and there'll be more, hopefully, independent, which means, because I don't know about you, but, most high streets, you know what you're going to come across. And then you come across one which, this is different. This is all, mainly independence. And it's great because you just don't know what's around the corner. And you get kind of like, curious and so forth. And I think for me, that's a large part of what's gone out of a lot of retailing and retailers and needs to come back. And I think we're starting to see that come back. And that's that element of intrigue and curiosity and inspire me. Make me want, because I've got so many inputs coming at me, digital or otherwise, every day. All these things which are trying to grab my attention and grab my wallet and so on and so forth. So I want you to inspire me. And hopefully, we'll start to see that on the high street.
So we are about to commit on social media, so you can't change your mind. These are going out right now. We've got to commit our hopes for 2020, our recommendations for 2020 directly out there, which we're going to do. And then we're going to ask if there are any questions from the audience, or if it's easier, we can just have a coffee with you afterwards. So before I do that, I'd really, really like to thank Andrew and Richard for their brilliant insight. I know we don't get a chance to be in the physically same room and the same time together because we're normally all doing the same sort of thing, but it's a joy to spend time, really listen to your expertise and influence and see how these very different paths have ended up bringing us to this point. I really hope that we can continue to help our retail clients and our service clients and certainly learn all the way through. Just keep adapting for that. So 2020 and beyond, Andrew, succinctly, what are your tips, recommendations for anyone who's on our live stream? Hello, live stream people as well, and are tweeting and things like that. What is it?
For me, it's very simple, and it's summed up in one word, two actually: be relevant. Relevance. For me, that's the key, because that goes back to an awful lot of things that we've been talking about. It means being in the moment. It means adding value. It means being within the context. So if you think about, and what I say to people is, think about your own experiences with brands, with retailers, and where it's really meant something and where it hasn't. Usually where it's really meant something, it's added value, will be where it's been relevant to me as the customer. And I think that it's exciting, because I think that's what we're seeing more of, and we're going to see more and more of. So yeah, 2020, be relevant.
Thank you.
So if you look at the retailers that are doing well at the moment, JD Sports, Selfridges, Aldi, Lidl, Boohoo, Primark, some of them are pure online retailers. Some of them, Primark, don't have a transactional e-commerce website. Some of them are the dreaded word, omnichannel, multi-channel, but operate in physical and digital realms. But the common characteristics, the common theme that you can tie with all of these retailers is that they're relevant to their consumers. They have a unique proposition that stands out from the market. They have values that they actually believe and stand for, and they understand their customers. So it's kind of a bit of retail 101, but that's what I truly believe.
And I have a plea that it's time to come together. It really is, because we need to have these towns and cities and places to live in, to be with one another. We need some harmony. We need to show in the business world that we can do this and be grown up about it, and we can learn from each other. So whether that's a retailer outreaching to a charity and making them actually physically part of their business rather than just donating to them, whether it's about two businesses coming together with synergy, or it's going back to those 1,000 independent retailers we're working here. They were learning the hard way, but they're actually delivering on it, and just saying we're part of a community, we all have a share in this, we need to deliver and put back. I think it's about coming together. I would absolutely love to see far more partnerships and alliances in retail, just the same way that we have today. So thanks very much for those tips. Audience, if there are any questions, we'd be very happy to take them. If not, if you'd like to have a coffee, we can have a chat with you till the end of the event. But thanks very much for coming and braving fire, rain, media onslaught, and everything else you've had to face to get here.